So, I think we should go. You're live. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start. It's actually running late, so maybe we can gain 4 extra minutes afterwards. My name is Judy Dempsey, and this morning, our first session, we're going to look at rather a complex and controversial, indeed, sadly, very topical subject, which is called securing the homeland. And the whole idea of securing the homeland does come into very special play, given that how can your homeland be secured when you actually have, as we saw in the attack in Boston, when it comes from inside. And we will try to broaden out the debate to look at cybersecurity and other issues which actually play into the whole changing definition of security. No longer conventional security, no longer state-to-state issues, but it's much more complex and often difficult to identify. And I'm delighted to have 2 terrific experts and guests on the panel. And by the way, we are 3 ladies, as you've noticed. First of all, I'm delighted to have Mary Ellen Callahan, and a very great expert on homeland security and cybersecurity and other issues. She was former Chief Privacy Officer, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Washington. Welcome, Mary Ellen. It's great to have you. And on my right, a very old friend who's been around for some time and who is specializing. And the great merit about you is your flexibility, how you move with the times. Right. And you've become a great expert now in cybersecurity. We're delighted to have you, Baroness Neville-Jones, otherwise known as Pauline Neville-Jones. And it's now a very nice title, Special Representative to Business on Cybersecurity of the UK Government. And of course, you were former Minister of State for Security. So, it's my task to do 2 things. One is to moderate this with minimum interruption. And secondly, after our 2 guests have raised what they wanted to raise in about 5 minutes, I want to try to make this as inclusive as possible and involve the audience as much as possible. I think it's a very important subject. It's an international subject which touches everybody and every state and societies. So without further ado, I think I'll ask Mary Ellen to kick it off and see what you think are the issues now.
Thank you very much, Judy. I think, as Judy said, the concept of homeland is a relatively new one, at least a renewed one, I guess is a way of saying it. It is, in the United States, really didn't engender a definition until after September 11th, 2001, where the concept of an internal threat as opposed to an external one was obviously, sadly, displayed with the attacks in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So as a result, the Department of Homeland Security was created about a year afterwards. And there's a lot of questions about the Department of Homeland Security. What does it do? What does it not do? But I thought I would kind of kick off this panel to talk about what the United States thinks about what is Homeland Security. And the concept of Homeland Security is not just the department, but it's more of an enterprise or an infrastructure, whereby all of the different levels, local, state, national, and international, all operate together. We just had a review of what Homeland Security means, and the definition was a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life, and I always say, including privacy, can thrive. And I think that that's a really great summary of what we think about with Homeland Security, of having the different layers and the different levels of interaction. And the Department of Homeland Security has 5 missions, and I'm happy to talk about any of them, and also happy to talk about the privacy and civil liberties issues with each of them. But the first is preventing terrorism and keeping the country safe. And we do that obviously in coordination with our national security brethren and our law enforcement brethren, as shown with Boston this week. The second issue is controlling and defending our borders, and included in that is the use of passenger name records. And I was on the U.S. team that just recently negotiated the PNR agreement with the European Commission. So if people have questions on that, I'm happy to discuss. The third is administering immigration. And of course, the U.S. has is currently considering an immigration reform approach. The fourth, I'm happy to discuss with the Baroness, is cybersecurity, securing and safeguarding cyberspace. And we do that, again, in conjunction with other elements and other governments, of course. And you have to have the private sector in this dialogue. And then the fifth is resilience. And again, I think Boston showed a great example of resilience this week as the community worked together with the law enforcement, with national law enforcement such as the FBI, and with local people identifying the attackers. And as we know, the purported bombers, one was taken into custody overnight and is in serious condition. But that's an example of kind of the infrastructure and the enterprise of Homeland Security that couldn't have existed, 12 or 13 years ago.
Gosh, Mary, thank you very much for being so disciplined and concise. I mean, you have raised very important issues, and particularly ones that affect the European-American relationship, particularly immigration and the passenger data, the sharing of passenger data, not to mention how immigration will affect long-term the US policy. Pauline, I'll pass it over to you. I mean, I think you've got your cue for cybersecurity, but please.
Well, I will say something about the other parts of it, because certainly when I was security minister, and I was also responsible for the things that Mary's just been talking about. I just make one comment about the sort of world we live in now. You rightly said, what we worry about now is the security of the homeland. And it's just a very sharp contrast to the Cold War, the era of the Cold War, when what we feared was annihilating war, an external threat, one, however, that could have wiped us out. But we had a very strong sense of solidarity at home. There turned out to be the odd spy, but nevertheless, people had the confidence, both in the relationship with the state and with their neighbour, that we were all on the same side. Mm-hmm. And what the present situation is liable to breed, of course, we don't have anything like the fear of warfare actually touching our soil, though it's not to be excluded. It's not our daily preoccupation, but we are increasingly worried about the solidarity of our domestic societies, our trust in the state, and our trust in each other. And that is potentially extremely corrosive for democracies. And you're right to put some emphasis on the equal vigilance that we need to have, particularly in legislation that we may need to pass for security reasons, that actually it doesn't corrode the values for which we ultimately stand, which are the civil liberties of the individual. And I do think that's now become one of the major challenges. In the UK, I mean, what has been described is very similar to what's happened in my own country, and I think it's what's happening elsewhere. All our government structures are slightly different. The Home Office in the UK, which would be the DHS equivalent, doesn't have quite the same brief, but it has a very similar one, and it deals with border control, it deals with policing, and it deals with counterterrorism. We have had to invent, as indeed the US has, new structures as well. And ours have taken, I suppose, 2 or 3 forms. One is that we have put in place inside the Home Office a special office for security and counterterrorism, which focuses mainly on all the implications of counterterrorism. And out of that emerged a policy framework which has implications broader than counterterrorism, but which is born out of it, and it had the 4 parts. It's the famous 4 Ps which the UK invented. Prevent, which is how do you actually, in a society where there is the potential for homegrown terrorism, which is now not exclusive to the UK, others are experiencing it as well, but how do you actually create a society of a kind where people are not tempted? And that includes both prevention of radicalization and de-radicalization when it has happened. Very painstaking, very, very difficult stuff, but very important. The second is also pursue, i.e. go after them. The third is protect, that's to say strengthening crowded places, places where people meet, to design in security insofar as you can, so that anything that you have to do in addition, for a big event is reduced to a lower minimum. practiced immensely, I might say, in the London Olympics, where we designed security into the very fabric of the main site, with all sorts of implications, and have real-time security operating, police cooperating with intelligence services, which is, the fundamental now, really. And you do it at a heightened level at a big event, but you're doing it all the time in any event. And the fourth is prepare. Prepare is actually, well, what do you do when it goes wrong? This is FEMA. This is the contingencies that you need to prepare for. And out of that has emerged an approach to security, which is more general than Homeland, but it very much affects Homeland, which is a national risk register, all the things that we think can come at the UK, both motivated threats and non-motivated as well, things like pandemics, but which can actually affect either security or safety, or normal daily life, which is linked to safety. And we end up saying we need an all-hazards approach. And what's more, it boils down to an all-society approach, because the key thing about the nature of Homeland Security is that it doesn't involve, frankly, the traditional instruments of the armed forces. You find your police are in the front line. They are the people that have to pick up a lot of the pieces, whether it's after a terrorist incident or whether it is after a civil contingency. It is they who have to go in and actually become the first responders along with the other blue light services. So suddenly your police forces, have as important a role in your daily life, in your security, as actually your armed forces. Now that's a very big change. And it's one I think that police forces are only getting used to rather gradually. So one last thought. Border control is very important in all of this. However, and the UK, actually agrees with the US approach, which is quite intrusive, I have to tell you, and it does cause difficulty. And not all of us like, the effects on our personal travel. But I have to say that as aeroplanes are a favourite target, you've got to do something about their safety. So you do have to know before people get on the plane, rather than when they get off on your border, who's on it, and therefore the concept of border control, of course, then becomes the starting point of the journey, not the end point of the journey when you actually meet the immigration officer at the desk. Finally, on cyber. Cyber, in a sense, incorporates all of the things that I've been saying. And, of course, the thing about cyber is that the threat comes at you where time, distance are abolished, by the nature of the technology that's being used. And it so penetrates our society that when I said, it's not all hazards, it's also all society, it is actually all of us involved actually in our own individual security through good personal hygiene and the use of the computer. But above all, we have to have a partnership between government agencies and the private sector if we are to protect some of the things which are most valuable to us. And this is not just criminal theft of financial assets, which of course is big stuff. It's also, in the end, the seed corn of our economies. And it is the intellectual property on which, in the end, our economies rest as our competitive edge in the world. And if that is taken from us in a sustained way, it is happening. Make no bones about it. It's institutionalized in China, and it is a very big challenge to us.
Pauline, you raised a huge amount of issues, and I'm very tempted to intervene, but I shouldn't. Yeah. But as a moderator, I have to make sure that certain issues are raised, or I'd like a certain issue to be raised. Before I throw the panel the questions out of the floor, I'd like to just ponder two thoughts. And I've asked this repeatedly at these cybersecurity seminars. First of all, the question of the terrorism, whether it's homegrown or external. Have either of you, in all your analysis, concluded or asked, what is the role? What is the motivation? Is it to undermine the democracy? Is it to particularly in the United States, which has a shocking reputation abroad now, especially in the Middle East. What is it what motivates them? And linked to this is how we reconcile this important security with the duty of governments is to protect its citizens. How you reconcile this with the values that we try to project as the West and as these important anchors for our societies. Marion, would you like to mention, and then we throw it out to the floor after Pauline takes it up too?
Absolutely. No, those are really hard and thoughtful, and that's the nut, and that's the basis of all that we have to deal with is the Baroness mentioned radicalization and de-radicalization. And I think that type of engagement and outreach is crucial in all of that, and there has been a concerted effort by the US government and state governments to try to address that issue and to try to worry about disenfranchised portions of the society. We haven't been wholly successful. With that said, it's an important element, and it's got to be the root of all of these issues. With regard to your question about the duty to protect and how do you integrate or have protect the civil liberties and have the Western values to be protected, I think about that all the time. I mean, that's essentially what my job was. The unique nature of the Department of Homeland Security is that because it was created 10 years ago, it was able to put in a chief privacy officer reporting directly to the secretary. I was unique in the federal government in the sense that I reported to the secretary, I dealt with policy issues, I was engaged at every level. I had to approve every new program and system that the government had that collected personally identifiable information, and also had a policy role in the whole federal government. I also had investigatory authority. So if somebody went off the rails, I could investigate them within the department. And I had a counterpart, which was a civil rights and civil liberties officer, which again is unique in the federal government. Because it was a new department, they thought about those issues and how do you integrate those two elements. And the civil rights, civil liberties officer dealt with engagement, dealt with radicalization, tried to deal with the ethnic communities that were most directly affected. One of the areas that particularly this administration has been trying to address is one that you mentioned, Judy, is this concept of trust. We have to regain the trust of the American people, of the Europeans, and to understand that we're all working together for a common good and a common collective. When I was Chief Privacy Officer, I actually went to 20 EU member states in my official capacity as Chief Privacy Officer. I missed Slovakia, so now I'm happy to be back. But with that said, the distrust of the United States was palpable. And that is something we really have got to work to engage both at the grassroots level when you're talking about disenfranchised youths like the Chechen brothers in Boston, or our really important European colleagues.
Pauline, do you want to add anything to this?
If I might, just yes.
Please.
I mean, I think one of the questions is, were they disenfranchised? And what I've been witnessing reminded me rather of experience we've had in the UK, where immigrants coming from areas of tension themselves, I mean, I'll give you an example, Kashmir, tend to import their militancy and their internal aggravation into their new society, and they don't lose it as easily as those who come from less conflicted places. So, I mean, there may be some clue there as to why it was, despite appearing to be Americanized, nevertheless, this seed corn was in them somehow. All I would say is, I mean, you ask about motivation, and it's a very, very important question. It's a mixture. Usually, what we have found, we worry about two kinds, don't we, of terrorism. Islamist terrorism, and I'm not going to go into the business of definition of terms, but also right-wing terrorism. The first associated with bombs, and the second usually with guns, and I have to say more prevalent in the US than it is in some other places. But, you know, Norway, that was guns, Breivik. I think that to take the Islamist, I think, which is the one which, you know, where there is, it's more difficult actually to suss out what the various strands are. What we have found is that usually there is inspiration somehow, somewhere from abroad. But it takes its root in people who also themselves reject the values of the society in which they are. In other words, you know, they reject democracy, they reject notion. They want very often, these extremists, they want to live an isolated life, and they want to draw others into rejecting the notion of the legitimacy, for instance, of voting. The danger of it is that it's founded on a credo which seeks to separate itself from the society in which it is implanted. And so part of the de-radicalization process or prevention is to seek to re-implant or to implant a different set of values. You cannot do it. We have, I think, now a good experience of being quite clear that while the police can do quite a lot, they cannot do it without the active help of members of the same community, who in the end have to be the leaders in actually turning round people who have gone down that path. So clearly, the very big message is don't let it happen. So nation building, exactly what kind of values do you seek to inculcate actively in the community? Itself then becomes an issue. What do you teach in the classroom? But what you also seek to implant in the family as well. So it's, you know, you keep on coming back to this notion that it's all society.
It's also very, from my point of view, it's also quite glib to say it's also because of globalization, but it certainly feeds into it. The way
That's true.
The whole system of
And the whole
communications.
business of movement, and the whole business of the fact that, you know, a family can live in a foreign country and watch television from their native land and never integrate and never speak the language. And it's true that I do think the Muslim immigration into Britain, which is the latest of them all, has come at a time when communication has meant that actually you can live spiritually elsewhere. And it's harder to integrate in those circumstances. And if your women folk don't ever speak the language, which is it can be the case, you don't have the natural setting for normal integration as we've understood it earlier.
Well, it's a separate issue, and I'd like to hear the audience on this. It does bring up the whole complex issue of integration.
Absolutely.
Leaving aside the immigration, which is hugely controversial, becoming quite a big issue in Europe. It's a headache enough for the Obama administration, but integration is just so important, and it's a debate now that's finally taking place in Germany. I'd like to open up the floor. Excuse me, the lights are very strong, so I haven't got my sunglasses. So I would ask you to do two things, three things, raise your hand. Secondly, please identify yourselves. And thirdly, I'm going to be quite strict on this. One question. One. There's no exceptions. You can put your hand up another time. And if you do want to make a comment, please make it short and very focused. So thank you. I'll just, I'm going to take 5 questions at a time. One question there, two, 3, 4, yes. Thanks, Jan. Maybe Jan Techel can help me. And 5. Okay, so the first over here, please identify
Charles
yourself.
Tannock, Member of the European Parliament. My question is directed at our American guest regarding Tamerlan, the dead Boston Chechen bomber. It's reported in the press that indeed he was interviewed by the FBI a couple of years ago, having spent 6 months abroad, presumably in Russia, and presumably at the request of a foreign government, presumably the Russian government. Is this a serious breach of intelligence and security from the Homeland Security Department's point of view, the fact that he was interviewed and actually dismissed as being no risk to American security?
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to take the 5, if that's
Yep,
okay, Mary.
great.
The second question was over here, yes. Oh,
Good morning. Thank you for fascinating debate. My name is Rastislav Kaczor. I'm Slovak Atlantic Commission. It's one question with 2 dimensions. And that is, the world is changing.
You're setting a very dangerous precedent here.
That is the same question for those. The world is changing faster than our institutions are able to respond to. And those of us who worked in the world of traditional defense and security, we know that what was the separation role? This was the military, this was intelligence, this was interior, and they had their own roles. There was hard to bring then interagency cooperation even then, but now this seems to be so vital how we deal with this. You know, what are the challenges, what we can do in this. And second to this, we got more and more information. Now we can listen to everyone, we can get tons of information, knowing everything about everyone. But this is a huge, huge haystack. How we find the needle, how we handle this dimension. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was, I'm not going to say anything about your double-pronged question. The third, we have a lady here in the second row, please, here.
Good morning. My name is Natalia Marchevska. I work on NATO-Russia relations, but also representing an organization called Young Professionals in Foreign Policy in Brussels. I have a question. Baroness, I was at the East-West Institute Cybersecurity Conference 2 years ago, and you spoke a lot about the role of business. There's a lot of business represented there. I would like to know how that is progressing in terms of the business, the private and the public sector balance, and also the role of international organizations such as NATO, in developing cyber strategies. Thank you.
That's a very good question, since it's getting increasingly on the NATO agenda. We have a fourth question here. Yes, please. And then the final one.
Thank you very much. My name is Kazimierz Sikorski. I'm coming from Poland, from Polish National Security Bureau. And we have just finished our Polish National Security Review, and one of the conclusions goes to the growing importance of Homeland Security. And my question goes, shouldn't we to discuss Homeland Security together with defense? Because many resources of defense are useful to solve Homeland Security and vice versa issues. So perhaps we should translate this in a single strategy, the Homeland and Defense Security issue. Thank you.
That is extraordinarily controversial, given that especially Eastern Europe and Central Europe had to really separate out the civilian and defense after the end of communism in 1989. We have the fifth and final set of the first set of questions. There was a fifth question back here somewhere. Yes, please.
Milan Ježovica, MESA 10 Bratislava-based think tank. I have a question that has to do with terrorists sowing distrust among us, which of course is the backbone of the way that we live. What we respond with is the invasion, limitation, and at the end, probably loss of privacy. Are we really doomed with the loss of privacy? Is there a limit which we will not exceed in limiting the privacy in responding to terrorist threat?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question, especially when you look at the number of video, what do you call this technical term, these cameras, closed-circuit television cameras increasingly, which do clearly have an important role. I think we should start with the last question first. The trust, the loss of privacy, we go back to this issue, can a balance be struck?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and as I said, it's one I think about all the time. And the closed-circuit television in Boston is actually an interesting example because the vast majority, I think it was like 90% of the televisions were actually not owned by any government. They weren't owned by Boston. They certainly weren't owned by the nation, but they were owned by private businesses trying to protect their own circumstance. And so it's a little bit different than in the UK, where the UK has its own control of the CCTVs. Ours is more business-based, and then the government was able to access it in a circumstance of a threat. And so going to Milan's question, I think that this element of obtaining information at the crucial time, when it's relevant, as opposed to collecting information just for the purpose of it may be useful someday, is an important distinguishing factor and an important way of kind of embedding privacy into the process. So the FBI never needed to see Lord & Taylor department stores video until somebody killed 3 people with a bomb. And in that circumstance, I think that type of data minimalization is an important element in this world of big data, that we think about how we deal with information and when we need the information. And I'll tell you, when I was in the government, and certainly now as a private lawyer, people say, oh, I need it, I may need it someday, so I'm going to collect it. But instead, you need to go and define the parameters and think about when you want to do it and work on the threats associated.
But Mary, this get back to Charles Tanner's question.
Yeah.
I mean, did you mess it up here? I
was going to
didn't
go there,
notice.
but we were going in order.
I know,
so.
I'm going, but it's a follow-up. So
So that's an interesting question. I mean, it segues with Milan's question, which is if you have so much information that you're unable to sift through it, that is as much a problem as it is that if you didn't have the information. And there, after the Christmas Day bombing, or actually, I think in Europe, you guys call it the Detroit attempted bombing. We call it Christmas Day, which I think is funny. But after that, there was that question about whether or not people connected the dots. And I obviously am not in the administration anymore. I certainly didn't work for the FBI, so I can't speak to what that interview was about or what the subject of it was. I can say that if the FBI interviewed the older brother, then likely they have a file regardless of what it is. I don't know what follow-up they did. But again, it goes to this kind of, is there a predicate question about these individuals, and if so, what's the follow-up? But I think it's a question that's going to need to be addressed by the Bureau. I agree with you.
And it touches Ambassador Katch's point about how you identify, how you deal with the information. And Pauline, the business private cybersecurity issue. I mean, this was raised at the Munich Security Conference for the first time. Is there shared interest, or is this up to business really now to deal with cybersecurity?
Well, it's up to business to implement. I think that it's a shared activity between government and the private sector in terms of what is going to be the strategy, what are going to be the mechanisms that give force to that strategy, and it's up to business then to implement in terms of their business operations the security measures that they need to take. But why does government need to be involved? Government has better access to the threat than private sector. And it is your signals agencies, your intelligence agencies that have a better grasp on a real-time basis of the cyber threat coming, and it is continuous. Do not be under any illusion that this is big. This is a very big threat, and it is on an absolutely continuing basis. And all the phrases about sustained threat and so on, I mean, are extremely relevant here. In the UK, there are limits, both in terms of resources and law, on what our signals agency can do. What we have sought to bring about are cooperative arrangements on an industry-government basis where information is shared to build up a real-time picture into which everybody feeds, but also takes information, with the aim over time of it becoming largely self-sustaining in the private sector itself. And I don't think that's a false objective. I think that can be attained. I think there'll always need to be some government input, but I think it can be and should be, on the whole, over time diminishing. That has now been put in place in some of the more obvious in areas of real vulnerability, telecoms, defense, financial services. It's not rolled out over the whole economy, but frankly it needs to be. Certainly it needs to be rolled out over the parts of the economy which are really important to national wealth. And those aren't necessarily things that you would think of immediately, but they do obviously include pharmaceuticals, huge R&D, valuable R&D. It includes things like mining. Commodities companies are now very, very important and are after scarce resources around the world. And so both their strategies and their company policies and what they're trying to do is of huge interest, I fear, to competitors. So these are, you have to identify, where your real interests lie. And in the UK, it's the security service that helps companies actually come to terms with the threat to them and the particular threat to their industry. And the government has also put out guidance to boards and management. This has to be taken seriously at the top of companies. It's not going to work unless top of companies The board and the senior management take it seriously. They need to understand the value of their assets. They are the ones that need to put the layered security in place. They are the ones that actually, in the end, have the duty to the shareholder. So it's top level activity, and it also has to take place not just in big companies. The last point I'd make is that some of the most valuable intellectual property any country possesses lies in SMEs and startups.
Exactly.
And so we have somehow to find a way of cascading security down at affordable prices. And the affordability of security is now one of the issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you want to come in, Mary Ellen?
Yeah,
I'm not forgetting the Polish question.
I actually may integrate that into my remarks anyway. So,
Please.
Yeah. So the cybersecurity issue, as the Baroness said, the threats are very real. They're very live, and I think it's worthwhile to think about them as three different types of threats. The impact or result may be the same, but the motivation may be different. And the first type is what the United States calls advanced, persistent, state-sponsored threats. So that means China.
Exactly.
And Iran, and to a lesser extent, other nation states. But the APT, or advanced persistent threats, are essentially the infrastructure that the Baroness spoke about, the organized approach that's led by a nation state to try to get information. And that information may be of a military nature. It may be of a commercial nature or an economic nature, as she said, going to some of the R&D and the startup elements, but the purpose of it is to collect information for them to have the ability to engage or interact with the West. The second type of threat is just as serious, but it is a different motivation, which is kind of organized cybercrime. And by this I mean wholesale theft of information, theft of primarily financial information, but not exclusively. And the goal there's a whole kind of gray, black market of information and trying to get access. Also, again, this research and development may be relevant, but the infrastructure is about money rather than about information for information's sake and trying to collect knowledge. The third type of threat that may not be as prevalent in the EU, but at the same time is an important one to think about, is the individual threat. Primarily, people think about hacktivists in this circumstance, anonymous and others who have political intentions or embarrassment pretensions, but it also could be disgruntled employees. It also could be an insider threat. So all three types of these cybersecurity issues are important ones to think about and to consider. And the way that businesses need to respond is to know about these threats. Again, the incentive of a cyber criminal is going to be a different incentive than an advanced persistent threat who may be just sitting there and wanting to watch the information so they know what's going on. And this information sharing that the Baroness spoke about is crucial. And there's kind of three different ways of information sharing. One is between companies. The other is from the government, whether they found out about it from other companies, pushing it out to industry to say, hey, we understand that this type of threat is occurring right now. And the third is from the industry into the government to let them know what's going on. And as I mentioned, Homeland Security is the point person for the .gov space, so our government structure, as well as the liaison to the private sector in most part. And we distinguish a little bit between the way the UK has dealt with cybersecurity, because there's been a conscious decision to put the cybersecurity apparatus for the liaison to the business community in Homeland Security, which is not a national security entity. It's not a military entity. It coordinates with all of them, and it's the synergies of it. But I think having a civilian defense of cybersecurity is really important, and it goes to the civil liberties and privacy issues that we spoke about in answering the first question. And so I think that that's an important structural point to get across.
Do you want to come in quickly, Pauline?
Well, let's
Quickly,
get
though.
I
don't
think
want to have
actually
another.
we're closer than that has just been painted, because the two agencies in the UK are GCHQ, which is neither military nor civilian, and the Security Service is definitely civilian, that do those two things. I did want to say just two things about structures. I mean, somebody said quite rightly, can government catch up and you used to have defined roles, and haven't they now changed? And I think actually what we've been saying does show actually that that government has got the message, and it is using traditional and existing agencies in new ways. And the great message is, not as it used to be, you operate on the basis of need to know, now you operate on the basis of need to share. And that has transformed operations inside government, and it has to transform operations actually between government and those who are affected by security considerations. So there has been a big revolution there. We will have also in the UK, we have a single national security strategy. Somebody said, can't the military and the civilian come together? Aren't these all part of the same game? Answer, yes. So you do have to have a single strategy in our view. On the other hand, there are definitely, according to different constitutional frameworks, roles for each of the players. And we do not in the UK, for instance, give the military a major role. They are aid to the civil power. When invited, when asked, they come in behind. But the primary responsibility for Homeland Security in the UK lies with civilian agencies. And we want to keep it like that.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very important point to make. There were so many issues raised here. I mean, give us the day when companies will actually share their secrets. I mean, this is the drawback of dealing with cybersecurity because it's about competition. However,
well, they are.
Depends
I think what companies are beginning to realise is that when one of them takes a hit of a kind which is reputationally extremely damaging, it isn't just the company, it's the sector that actually suffers, because trust declines in all of them. So actually the incentive to share information in order to avoid the threat to all of them, and they're all in the end linked, through supply chains and through all sorts of subsidiary agreements which aren't obvious at the top label of the company, means in fact they have a much, much stronger interest actually in sharing this kind of information and not actually competing on each other's disasters.
Well, Pauline, I remember, I'm going to open up the floor to another set of questions. I remember speaking to two company executives in February. They're doing business in China, and they were exactly dealing with on how to protect their systems from, guess what, theft, intellectual property rights. And they are seriously wondering how you actually inbuilt this anti-cyber breaching system into the computers, and they're so afraid that that will be stolen and breached, and therefore everything will be compromised. I mean, it's a big issue now facing companies working in China. I want to open the floor to something we haven't touched here for the last 2 or 3 days, because it does. It involves the instruments of Homeland Security, which is drones. And I was wondering, I'd like to, you don't have to have a question about the drones, but I'd like to open up the floor to another set of questions, 5 again. And I'm willing to, number 1 here, number 2, Mary Dejevsky, number 3, I forgot your name. Anybody at the back here? And number 4, and 5 seems a good number. If there's not a 5th, it doesn't matter. Okay, here we go.
My name is Andrei Nosko. I work for the Open Society Think Tank Fund. I would like to ask a question related to this non-traditional business between the state partnership, especially the evil one. And how can the states deal with the problem of plausible deniability when the threat is clearly sponsored by a state actor, but the state actor that has sponsored the threat has a plausible deniability, which combined with the situation when the threat is really territorial. So it's very difficult to target it, where did it come from, and thus to make extrapolation that the state should be able to maintain the sovereignty, and therefore if the threat came from the territory, it's the responsibility of the state. What can we do about that?
Interesting question. Thank you very much. There was a second question. Oh yes, over here, Mary Dejevsky.
Mary Dejevsky from the Independent newspaper in London. When I tore myself away from the television coverage from Boston this morning, there was the beginning of what seemed like a very interesting debate, which was this particular case, if the facts actually check out, is like a microcosm of being on the border between common crime and international terrorism. And I wondered whether you'd like to comment on the two definitions and the crossover, and whether it's actually a useful distinction.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mary. The third question was over here, please.
Alex Hersey, Ministry of Defense Institute for Security and Defense Studies, Slovakia. I'd like to ask the UK panelist, with your experience with interoperability on the ground, based on your experience in Northern Ireland, could you please tell us how successful is your cooperation on the ground between the military and the police, and perhaps comment some of your recipes for success from your lessons learned? Thank you very much.
The defence and military civilian won't go away. And there's a fourth question here, please.
Thank you. Miguel Silva. I'm with the European External Action Service. Baroness NEVILLE-JONES mentioned the current difficulties when dealing with these migrant communities that are detached from their host societies. We can, of course, work on immigration reform, but what do we do about these detached societies that already live within our countries, and how can we ensure the protection of civil liberties if we have to keep these communities under surveillance? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very interesting group of questions. We'll start with open society question, the plausible deniability.
Really difficult.
That's a toughie. That's a toughie. I'll go on to the second question. We can go back to no.
No, well, I mean, let's. I mean, we can't just avoid the difficult questions. I mean, I think that
It's only joking.
The first answer to the question is good defence. I mean, precisely because attribution is extremely difficult and takes time. Though I think we're getting to the stage of feeling that it's not absolutely impossible. But one of the issues is, the time scale in which you can actually do attribution. First of all, you need to defend yourselves. Secondly, I think that while I am, I have real reservations about the attractiveness of active defence. That's to say, going after them, i.e., retaliation. Because of the difficulty of controlling side effects and the inability, I think, to control consequences, and you can end up with a quite unintended disaster. While I say I have real reservations about that, I do actually think the existence of a capability is a good idea. It acts as a certain degree of deterrence, and there are a number of countries that are actually going to do that. The third thing, I think, is we do naturally need. I think we as the law-abiding and law-making part of the world, and we need to hang on to both of those characteristics, particularly our right to make the laws. The world at the moment is run according to Western law. We need to hang on to that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it will be a really helpful thing to us to begin to introduce in a much more sustained way the notion of the laws of war applying in this area. Now, that doesn't prevent the kind of rogue activity that is a real danger, but it begins to identify it as rogue activity. It begins to limit it, and I think there, the work that's being done both in Tallinn and in other places, and what I think the US is now beginning to say about their interest in the adoption of the laws of war, and this will apply, of course, to drones as well, is really quite important.
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring up Mary Dejevsky's question. This is there this crossover between common crime and international terrorism? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough case, and I think we obviously don't have all the facts and don't have all the knowledge, but the concept of a terrorist act, at least the way that we try to think about it in the States, is when there's a political or a socio-political element to it, and that there's a conscious decision in terms of addressing it in that sense. And I think targeting, the biggest day in Boston and targeting the biggest event indicated that there are those elements of an act of terror.
There was thank you, Miriam. There was a question related. Specifically directed to you on the cooperation with the military and defence. We touched on it before, but I really want to deal with also the detachment, the sense of, I suppose, alienation. Our question raised about communities, how they don't feel how they feel detached from the society. Can we quickly just deal with the defence and military cooperation?
Well,
We've touched on it before.
the example that's been cited, of course, is Northern Ireland, where we use the army. I wonder, frankly, whether if we were doing Northern Ireland again, we would use the army in the way we did. And I think we would have a much, much bigger police element. However, there is very clearly, there is, in the end, you know, a spectrum of capabilities that you may need to use. And I think in our view, your frontline and all but your most severe circumstances, you're trying to put the police in there. You do have backup, however, from the military. Where do you see that? You see it in niche capabilities such as we would not want our police to start having to deal with nuclear, for instance, or chemical threats, or some of the more extreme ones, or indeed dealing with threats from the air. You know, in the case of the Olympics, you know, we put in place missile protection. We had to do that. And that is clearly a military function. Maritime surveillance, clearly a military function. So when you're trying to get a complete, in a sense, complete coverage of your homeland vulnerabilities, you do find that there are different roles for different players. And if we had a major terrorist incident during the Olympics, we would have brought the military in, and they would, if it had been an extreme element, we had transitional arrangements. We had actually exercised the police handing over to the military in a hot situation. A really difficult thing to put in place. And you need to be able to, you need to know how to do that. What you hope is you're not going to have to do it very often.
It's immensely complex operation as well. Forward planning, not hoping that you won't have to use it.
And you find your civilian services end up having also to have coverage, you know, and protection from
it's
from
immensely
live bullets.
sophisticated.
Yeah.
And the migrant communities, I mean, this is just so complex and difficult for every society. Miriam, would you like to touch on this? Given, I mean, there's migrant. I mean, America is the home of the migrant communities. I mean, is this an increasing problem now? How?
I don't know that I would define it as increasing. I think I would define it as consistent. And again, the United States is a land of immigrants in the sense that Europe isn't even with its movements and its own migrant communities. As I said, there are different levels of attempting to try to engage the communities and try to make sure that they indeed are not being disenfranchised or not being isolated in the way that can occur in today's technology and not being necessarily inspired. But it's hard because part of this is, at the grassroots level, it's every single element. To your point, it is engaging the leaders within the community and making sure, again, going back to my earlier theme of build up trust with them and have a common purpose to try to help support the homeland. And I think that it really is an incremental process where it's very hard to show success, but sadly with Boston, we may have identified a failure.
And it's easier said than done, the trying to make societies inclusive, because it also means opening up the police forces, the judicial systems, and the whole societal structures and state structures to immigrants.
Yeah,
make it really
it's very
inclusive.
important.
The police have to reflect the community.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And this is a slow debate, a late debate taking place in Europe.
You will see what a Sikh police helmet looks like these days. Very interesting.
We'll have you back next year, I hope. And now, we have actually, I'm going to be very disciplined. We have room for one last round. Keep the questions short, keep the answers short, and I'll have to put on my sunglasses again if there's any last questions. One over here. You're allowed another one. Anyone over here? This side. I don't want to miss anybody. Number 2. Oh, excellent. Number 3. Okay. And I think we can. That's perfect time now. Actually, 3 questions. Thank you. Yes.
So one more question about the drones you mentioned.
Oh yes.
Of course, we understand why we are using them externally, but how about using them at home? For the Homeland Security, can you expose some of your thinking and consideration with regard to dangers it may bring in terms of the values we are trying to protect? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. We had the second question here.
Nam Nguyen, Royal Australian Navy. My question is to the Baroness with regards to defence aid to civil community. Yes, there is a role for, I guess, a lethal application of force. However, do you feel that there is a need to employ greater intelligence and surveillance reconnaissance roles from the military for civil defence? Is there a greater need to apply these capabilities because of levels of funding and experience in operating in these roles?
Excellent question. And the third question was, yes. Reds, you
Two
can
mics.
shout.
A question goes to the communicating Homeland Security and security as a wider notion.
Excuse me, who are you?
Sorry?
Who are you?
Milan Ježović, I
Yeah,
asked the
just in
question
case
before.
others don't know you.
When you talk to the companies and to the people about the need to invest in security and homeland security, of course this is an investment which is quite costly. And the response is, all right, we are part of the alliance, we have security guarantees, so what do we need to do more? How do you make an argument that we do have to invest in homeland security and in security, especially with the new threats arising? How do you make that argument to the public and to the companies and to the business?
Really interesting question, given the whole decline of even NATO defence spending. We can group the three questions all in one. Pauline, would you like to deal with them?
Well,
we have
on
2.5 minutes.
drones briefly. I mean, there are obviously two kinds of drones, aren't there? There are armed drones and there are surveillance drones. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on armed drones, though I'm afraid I don't hold to the view that these are legitimate instruments of war, that, you know, the only legitimate instrument of war is if you put your own people in danger, and you're not allowed to do it on the basis of economizing on danger to your own forces. However, I do think the laws of war have got to apply, and that's, I think, you know, where the whole business of proportionality, justification, proportionality, and everything else do come in. On surveillance, you know, if you look at in a big demonstration in London these days, you'll find a police helicopter in the sky, which is the equivalent in many respects. Now, we haven't licensed, and we aren't anywhere near at the moment licensing drones for the purposes of surveillance. I think it's an issue that's going to come into focus, and I think people will see, and rightly in my view, quite significant civil liberties implications. However, it's a question of scale. You know, we already have the cameras. We already have in various forms in our societies the ability of government to intrude in private communication. Again, it's a question of how you regulate it, what you allow it to be used for, what the accountability of the system is, who is authorized actually to give permission for these things, that you have some confidence that actually they're used proportionately and legitimately. And I think that's where we have to go. And we will find all of that very hard because there are conflicting interests at stake and very important ones. The last thing on how do you convince people actually that they need to make this investment in the private sector. Well, one of the things the security service does, it goes off and tells companies rather horrifying stories that it knows about what's happened to some of their assets. And it's very, very powerful.
Very interesting. We have a lot to discuss after this. Marianne, you've got the last word to deal with some of these questions.
Sure. With regard to the drones, I completely concur with the Baroness of the distinction between armed drones and unarmed drones. And the armed drones that are used, given that that's not my portfolio, I will not talk about that, but I will talk about unarmed drones, which I think are really important, and I think it raises exactly the civil liberties issue that the Baroness raises. Currently in the United States, we use unarmed drones only on our borders, primarily our southern border to see if people are crossing the border, but we also use it on the northern border with Canada. That's disclosed. We have the issues. I've reviewed the elements. But in the future, as the Baroness said, I think there is a desire, a movement, and a fledgling industry of people who want to have unarmed drones to do certain elements. And I think the important thing is to define what those elements are ahead of time, because one thing that Homeland Security is looking at is how to do a drone to look for forest fires. We have these huge national parks. We want to identify the fire beforehand. So that's great and that's important. But to the proportionality point, which is not a US concept per se, but I think it applies in this context of, okay, so if you see a crime or you see somebody crossing the border when you're looking for fires, what do? And you should have those terms defined of, you know, do you retain it? I think the important elements for drones are secondary use, with whom you can share it, and how long you can retain it, I think are the important elements.
Absolutely.
Look, and also you can't stop technology, so therefore you need some kind of regulatory system. First of all, I want to thank our great panel. Thank you, Mary Ellen Callan. Thank you, Baroness Neville-Jones. Wonderful. And of course, thank you very much for the audience. You really made it along with our panel. Thank you very, very much. Now, one housekeeping rule, you're to stay seated. There's no coffee. Okay? The next panel is over there.